In this video, I'm going to introduce a new concept called loops. Loops are really where a lot of programming's power comes in. Whenever you find yourself doing a task that you repeat over and over and over again, doing the same manual task time and time again, whether it's moving around the keyboard, printing things, but you're doing the same task repeatedly. Oftentimes you can use a loop to do that many tasks thing over and over and over and over and over again. So the loop is going to allow us to repeat actions many times. It allows us to simplify our code. It allows us to do a lot of calculations very efficiently. All right, so how do we do loops? So we're going to start out with for loops, and we're also going to talk about do loops. And as you can see here, I have this set up to build some different kinds of functions. Notice we're going to start with the message box function and eventually get into square n times. So as we're going there, we need an input of a number. So we could square the number 5, and we could square it twice. We could also square it until it's bigger than 500, some sort of threshold. So that's what our inputs are going to be set up for. We'll get to where those come in a minute. But first, let's just do a simple loop to get an idea how this whole thing works. So we're going to start with a message box function. So let's go over to our VBA. So notice we already have our option explicit set up. I'm going to type my first function. And we'll type function message box. All right. Now the main point of this is to show you guys loops, but we do need to put something to return. We're going to put all done. So when this message box when this function runs, we're going to display a series of message boxes, and at the end we're just going to report all done in the cell we type it in. All right. So how many message boxes should we do? Let's let the user decide. So we'll call it the input number. And we're going to do this just a set number of, a whole number of times. So we'll make that input an integer. All right, now how does a loop work? Well, we're going to start with a for loop. And we're going to say for I equals 1 to input number. Next, I. All right, so there are a couple of pieces to kind of unpackage here. The first is this idea of what is I? All right? I is a very common number used both in math and in programming to index things. Right? Index is another word for counting. Basically, we're going to count how many times we go through a loop. So this I really is a variable. So we're going to start this variable. We're going to start at 1, and we're going to count up until the number input number. So whatever that user gives us, we're going to count that many times. The next I at the end tells it to go from the first I to the next one to the next one. And so it's going to cycle between the start, the middle, where we put our code, and then the end. So this is the loop. It's going to go over and over again. This is our for loop. Now, I, like I said, is the most common kind of index to use. So if you see an I or a J or a K, those are typical letters that are used to index over in these for loops. Now, remember, since we have our option explicit on, we have to initiate our variables. So we'll initiate I as an integer, and that's going to be our looping variable that we go from 1 to loop to input number. All right, where do we put our code? Well, all we want this loop to do now is just put a message box out there. So let's do a message box with the value I. So the idea is that each time through the loop, it'll report what is the value of I. And it'll do it until it's done it input number of times. So let's go check it out, see what it looks like, and hopefully it starts to make a little bit more sense. So we type message box, and let's start out with 3 loops. All right, so we set 3, we hit enter, and we see our message box. It pops up as a 1. Okay. Then a second message box pops up that says 2. Okay. A third message box says 3. Okay. The function is all done, so now we see that word all done in that cell B7 where we typed our function. If we change it now to message box 5, that same loop is going to run 5 times up until this number 5 occurs. And so we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 message boxes, and that's going to be the last one. Again, we get the all done once we're done running through our loop. So what we saw was message box coming up each time through the loop. We didn't do anything besides show this message box. All right, so what's another way that we can kind of validate that we're going through the loop without necessarily doing a message box every time? Because it actually gets really kind of tiring to click OK on all those message boxes as they pop up. So one way we can keep track of how many loops we've gone through is with this immediate window down here at the bottom. So what we can do is we can actually use a command called debug.print, debug.print, to print the value of I down in this immediate window. So let me make a little bit of room here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off this message box. All right, so we're not going to see it pop up every time, but instead what we're going to see is that whatever I is going to get printed into this immediate window as the function runs. Right? This is going to happen so quickly that we won't be able to actually see it with our eyes, but we can come back and see after it's run what has resulted. So let's flip back over. We took our message boxes off, so we're not going to see anything happen. And let's just do message box. Oops. So we just ran it. All right, we did it with 5. Let's flip back. And now we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that immediate window where that got printed. If we want to try it again, we can erase all that. Let's delete it. Let's come over here and instead put 15 in there. We say, okay, it's all done. Again, super fast. And now we see the numbers 1 through 15 have been printed in this immediate window. This debug.print really is going to let us track down any errors that we have in our code. It's a debug mode. It allows us to really understand how loops are progressing. And so we'll look at this again as we move further through different loop functions as well. But it's a very nice tool for keeping track of where we are in our code, where errors might have occurred, and allowing us to track those down.